Listen, last night the Giller Prize was handed out. That is a big deal. It is the biggest literary prize that we have in Canada. It is also not the whole story. Today we're talking about how the Gillers have been at the center of the rift over money that funds the arts and where the Gillers go from here. I'm Alamin Abdul Mahmoud, and this is Commotion. All right, take a listen to this moment from last night.
The winner of the 2024 Giller Prize, Anne Michaels for Hell.
I am thrilled for Anne Michaels. It is a beautiful book. It is such an honor to be recognized for all those years of hard work that you pour into what is, I think, often lonely work, pouring yourself into your writing. But also this year, let's be honest, this year the Giller Prize hits a little bit differently because for the second year in a row, the awards were the site of protest. The protests are because its lead sponsor, Scotiabank, has ties to an Israeli arms manufacturer through a subsidiary investor. Over the past year, more than 1,500 authors have signed a petition calling for the Gillers to cut ties with Scotiabank. 2 judges have resigned from the jury. More than 30 authors have withdrawn their books from contention, not to mention all the people who were not there in the room last night. At the same time, I should say, the subsidiary Scotiabank at the center of all of this has divested most of its holdings in Elbit Systems, which is that weapons manufacturer I was talking about. So it kind of seems in this moment like the thread that had connected a community of people who love books in this country and maybe believe in the power of literature is a little bit frayed. I would say that CanLit is hurting. Today, we're asking, what is the path forward from this moment? Ian Williams won the Giller Prize back in 2019. He's also this year's Massey Lecturer. His book could not possibly be more fitting for this particular moment because it's called What I Mean to Say, Remaking Conversation in Our Time. Ian, welcome to the show, friend.
Thanks for having me, Alamin.
Listen, let's start with maybe the wider picture. We were both at the Gillers last night. What was it like for you being in that room?
Yeah, so I spent the whole day sort of anxious, right, about it, and like conflicted and sort of unsure about what's going to happen. And, scenes of like Stephen King, Carrie flash through my mind, and you just like assume the worst, right? All of these like possibilities. Yeah. And it was really hard. I really couldn't quite concentrate on anything else. Because, when you believe across divisions, right? And you're really being pulled emotionally in 2 directions. And you want like both things to be true and to coexist. But very few people seem to want that. Yeah, it was rough, right? It was rough. How did you feel?
I think some degree of the same feelings, but also I want to say that like when we were there, you were the only person that I saw who said, "Can we take a moment and go talk to the protesters outside?" And so you stepped outside of the Giller Gala where it was happening, and then you walked outside and you took a moment to speak to some protesters. What was that conversation like? What did you hear when you went outside?
Yeah, I felt like I was in a bit of a bubble up there, and I kind of needed we knew something was happening outside.
Sure.
And why imagine it if we could kind of see it, right? And actually see what people were thinking and feeling and all of that. So yeah, a couple of us went down. And I was not prepared for my reaction. It was really moving, Elamine, right? It was really moving to see the small sort of group of writers out there and friends there.
Yeah.
Chanting and protesting and handing out pamphlets. And I had no comment at the time. I was just like in my feelings and my eyes kind of welled up. And there was people in there said like, you don't have to go back in, you can join us. Kind of small chant erupted like, join us, join us, join us. And I was like, I don't respond to that, right? Sure of any sort, right? I'm sort of, yeah.
Talk to me about the welling up. Like what do you think was happening when you were sort of having that emotional reaction to being outside?
Well, as a novelist, this is a familiar story, right? A small group of people against a very large power. And on one side, you've got people who frame their fight as like a moral cause and setting that against like decadence and all of that. And I don't think that's an accurate portrayal, but it falls nicely into a kind of like story that we tell
ourselves. You were wearing a
about
tuxedo.
Underdog.
There are people outside, right? Like it's the image sort of exactly looks like that, right?
Right, sure. right. So there's that. But I mean, I did go back in, and this is it. So the chant went from like join us, and when I did go back in, it went the chant went back to shame, shame, shame.
Hmm.
And I mean that's not to have you like your fellow writers. It hurts particularly from your own community, right?
Hmm.
Um, when I mean they were saying shame before, but when it resurges, when the resurgence is as you're sort of leaving there and they're saying shame to you for going back in. I'm like, no, that's not it either. It's not
Hmm.
join us. And if you don't join us, then it's shame on you. You can't, my usefulness to you is not simply a matter of like holding your position exactly. And when I don't, then it crosses over to I've become enemy again. For a moment, for a moment, Elamine, there's a possibility that I could be an ally
Hmm.
in a way that was recognizable to the group. And when I didn't do that to their satisfaction, again, I became the enemy. And I am not. I don't, those people are still my friends. I still, we can still go out and like have teas and coffees together. But the rhetoric of it was an all or nothing kind of situation.
Can I just want to, can we sit in this discomfort for just a moment? Because I think
Yeah.
it's an instructive kind of discomfort. I think one of the things that the protesters were trying to say is that the voice that they're trying to sort of present was not present in the room, and I'm not sure that I disagree. I'm not sure that the position that they were making was represented at all in the show, like in the event that you and I attended. I think for all the conversations that have been spurred this past year about arts funding, about our comfort with where that money comes from, I'm not sure that those questions were posed sufficiently in the show in order for those people to sort of feel like that was represented. I take your point when you say that like it's maybe not that kind of binary of join us and then shame. But I also take that seriously as maybe an outgrowth of an emotion that says, I don't feel heard by the thing that is happening there or by your way of even trying to have the conversation. I think like that's why you're the person to speak to this, is because you've been thinking so much about this conversation. And if there are people who are trying to say however you're speaking isn't speaking to me, I don't know how to tell them that they're not telling the truth. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that's a fair point. Um, and as you're talking, I'm trying to figure out how to do that properly, like within the context of the broadcast. Um, the broadcast had this great sort of feeling of,
Type of the Giller
uh,
broadcast, meant to sort of
yeah, the killer broadcast.
celebrate the
Right,
novelists who were nominated. Yeah.
right. Yeah. So, what would you have done? Given them like 5, 10 minutes? Like, how much time is enough to? I mean, they are the context for the killer this year, right? And so,
Hmm.
maybe to acknowledge this thing that's happening outside is not enough, right? You wanted a like greater depth and like just more
I
to
just
have those voices in the room themselves instead of paraphrased in there.
I certainly am not programming, the Gillers. But I would have,
Yeah,
what I would have said is, I think there
more
was an
space.
elephant in the room, right?
Yeah.
And also, I think like one of the uncomfortable facts of that elephant in the room was that like protest has a little bit been effective, right? Like at least through the past year or so, we've heard through a bunch of filings from, I think like Josh O'Kane has reported this out, but like the subsidiary Scotiabank that is invested in that weapons manufacturer has divested a lot of its holdings. It turns out
Right.
like protest is uncomfortable, but
Mm,
protest also maybe works, question mark, right?
mm,
And I think like that's to me, an expansive conversation, personally, would have maybe included that perspective also. And I don't know what that looks like, but I
mm,
would have loved to have seen attempts at that. I'm not saying that attempts have to be perfect. I'm saying it was surprising to me that the gestures to the context, as you say,
mm.
were not that big, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there was a gesture right off the top of the show, and Michael's her winning speech also sort of addressed it. Um,
That's true.
yeah, and the presence of it was there. I mean, like one of the first things I said there was like, the world has changed there, and maybe not like a direct and specific kind of reference. So I think
Yeah.
the killer folks had to make a decision here, right? And it's about sort of percentages and how much they acknowledged it, but they didn't quite give voice to it. I think that's what you're getting at. Um, and the decision they made seems to be like to focus on the book,
Yeah.
right? To focus on the authors and to sort of let the rest of it I mean, we'll spend the rest of our time talking about, the opposition to the Gillers and whatnot. But for that night, they really wanted to make something special for the authors in the books. And
Yeah.
you know what? It had these effect, like when you're in the room, it had the effect of actually being lost in a book. Like when I'm watching those packages, for a moment, I can sort of get back to what the Gillers were, 2 years ago,
Sure.
and really just kind of like value the authors and, oh, this is craft and this is what they're thinking, but this is what their book says. So I did feel lost in a book there.
Yeah.
As for your point about whether the protests worked or not, I think it will seem that way because that's the only thing we have. But
Yeah.
would this have worked if it happened not via protest, but through conversations with the leaders of the Giller Prize? Right? We don't know, right? If those people were actually not outside but in the room, talking with Scotiabank execs and talking with politicians and talking with the Giller Bank folks around a meal, would that have been equally as successful to get some of this divestment happening? We don't know because we went right to emergency response, right? We went right to protest. And sometimes we skip a whole bunch of intermediary steps and we land right at protest because we expect resistance and we expect difficulty without sort of giving people an opportunity to respond. Okay, that's just, I'm putting that out there as a possibility, alternate sort of methods of getting things done.
Yeah.
Things get done from outside the room and things get done from inside a room as well.
I want to acknowledge that is true, but I also want to acknowledge the fact that I think the war in Gaza ends up meriting a different kind of emotional response. I think some people go to protest because they otherwise sort of appear to be facing like a powerlessness, right? And I want to come back to that emotional powerlessness. But also, you talked about Anne Michaels' win, not an easy position at all for her to be in, and you pointed out that her speech sort of addressed all this. I want to give a moment to her acceptance speech, so here it is in full.
Everything I write is a form of witness against war, indifference, against amnesia of every sort. From when do we begin to count the dead? I've asked that question all my writing life, and I've been seeking in the darkest moments in history a specific hope, a hope that is inevitable, unassailable, a hope that one can trust with one's life, the only hope worth offering a reader. When writer and reader meet each other's gaze on the page, there is the possibility that something can be mended. Literature situates us morally. It recognizes the crucial distinction between what is impossible and what is futile. Everything I write is against futility. There is no moral righteousness. There is only morality. A book, especially this book, is nothing if it does not listen. Every book bears witness. Every book its own form of resistance and assertion. I'm here tonight in solidarity with that purpose, in solidarity with the long-listed and short-listed writers and every writer inside and outside this room.
Every writer inside and outside this room. What's your reaction to Anne Michaels' speech?
I love her, right? And like what that exemplifies to me is like writers, we need to trust each other, right? We are all trying to build a better world in our own way. And so the divisions that we sort of manufacture among each other seems to be like really unnecessary. The fact that all writers are not outside protesting doesn't mean that all writers are not engaged in, ending suffering, making this a better world. Leave it to writers to speak their truth, and little by little, from different sort of parts of society and different concerns, we will get this accomplished. But we don't need to sort of turn on each other and cannibalize each other in order to do this, right? And very soft-spoken, right? Anne will not be outside protesting or anything, but that was an extremely powerful move, right? About morality rather than sides, about mending rather than destroying. She's doing her own kind of work in her really graceful and quiet way. Let her do it without any shame.
But I think
that she's not doing enough.
I agree. I agree with that sentiment. I totally agree with that sentiment. But also, I am sensitive to the idea that there will be people who are uncomfortable with writers and their proximity to power in that room and their proximity to people who can, run banks and run different organizations, and like the funding for the arts comes from them. And I think it's a fair question to say, why do you want that proximity to power? Or what does that do for you? I don't have a good answer to that question. I really don't have a good answer to that question. But I do think like it's one thing that writers have to always navigate, and they're always asking themselves. And in moments like this one, especially in moments like this one, the thing that we're asking writers to do is a really hard thing to do. I want you to take a moment to listen to another part of a conversation that I had with previous Giller winner Omar Al-Akkad back in July. It's a bit of a longer clip. It's about a minute and a half as well. But also, I want you to hear what he has to say.
So here's the thing. And again, I apologize in advance for sort of going dark.
It's okay, man.
The last time that I talked to anybody from the Gillers, which was a few weeks ago, that morning, I woke up and the first thing I saw when I turned on my computer was photographic evidence of what it looks like when a 6-year-old girl starves to death. Now, I have a daughter about that age. I think you might as well.
I do.
And I have a story like that for every single day of the last 9 months. And in that context, I don't really care what happens with the killers, right? It doesn't matter. They're going to be fine. They've got a bank supporting them. I bet you that for every author who signed that letter, there's probably 10 authors who just want all of this to go away so that they can put on their nice suits and show up every fall at the Four Seasons or whatever and continue to celebrate because it's a fun night out. I get all of that. But from my personal perspective, I think of what the Palestinian poet Rasha Abdel-Hadi said about anything you can do to throw sand in the gears of genocide, you should do it. And in that context, trying to pressure this award to break with a company that is investing in an Israeli weapons maker makes perfect sense. And I still hope it happens in some form or another. But we are talking about this bizarre side drama in the world of Canadian literature that in the grand scheme of things feels so small.
Ian, that's part of my conversation with Omar Al-Akkad. When you hear that, I guess in contrast to the Anne Michaels speech, the idea of saying, actually, we need to hold this at an even greater distance because it is less significant. What do you make of that contrast between the two of them?
He's right about it in the grand scheme of things. In the grand scheme of things where people are dying, should we sort of be quibbling about, I mean, this is an extension of a war that we feel like we need to do something. And this is how we feel like we have some kind of agency, right? Yeah. Whether our agency actually has any impact, whether we're saving the lives of those 6-year-old kids, I'm not sure about that. I mean, it's kind of like idealistic to believe that we are. And we want to believe, and we want to sort of take on some of the suffering of other people too, right? You see somebody carrying a heavy tote bag and you're saying like, I want to carry some of that too. And this is our way of trying to do that. Intentions, heart, everything in the right place. Maybe if I can speak like elusively here, right?
Yeah.
My birthday falls on the same day that my grandfather died. And my cousin's birthday, no, sorry, I got that wrong. My cousin's birthday falls on the same day that my grandfather died. And my birthday falls on the same day that his mother, my aunt, died. So there's this kind of thing where every time our birthdays roll around, my parents' generation is like, happy birthday, Ian. And also your aunt died on this day too. So it's I can't like eat cake or, in Omar's words, dress up in a fancy suit and sort of go and celebrate and have a good night out. The day's always marred by a death or a loss somewhere. In this part of the world, we're comfortable. Elsewhere in the world, some bombs are going off, right? A fact of living in sort of a privileged Western society is that, there are terrible things happening elsewhere. Every once in a while, we catch conscience and we want to do something about it. But 98% of our lives, we've spent sort of ignoring the suffering of other people. And now that we've sort of risen above it, good, important, how sustainable is that? I'm not sure. Yeah. But I get Omar. A lot of respect for Omar, and his point is taken, right? But these aren't points that we pit against each other. Omar is a great point. yeah, you got to focus on that 6-year-olds who are dying there. But, this idea of being in a suit, sort of dancing, we're not dancing because 6-year-olds are dying. And we're not, celebrating without the knowledge of this happening elsewhere in the world.
Hmm.
But these are this kind of irony of being, that as writers, we understand these kinds of contradictions happen.
I want to talk about maybe in the last few minutes we have here, the fact that, look, there's no difference in quality between the books submitted this year and books submitted 2 or 3 years ago. Yet you have authors like Madeleine Tien who not only boycotted the awards, but she demanded that the Giller Prize remove her name and her image and her work from the website. They don't, she doesn't want to be associated with the prize at all. We have these relationships that have been fundamentally altered, I would say. People who were united around books are now divided more than they've ever been about the war in Gaza and where the funding for these prizes should come from. How do you imagine remaking the conversation? That's the title of your Massey lecture. How do you imagine remaking this conversation in such a way that allows these divisions to, maybe the word is not heal, but at least be able to speak to one another?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that we need to sort of be like in the same space with each other, right? And if it's hard for those people who are, it's yesterday about who's inside and who's outside, right? Like it's a physical space we were talking about.
Yeah.
If the folks who are outside cannot come inside because there are various mechanisms of security and stuff, then the folks who are inside need to come outside. And have those conversations too, right? So whatever traversing of boundary and barrier needs to happen, I strongly encourage that. And to sit in that space where people are saying shame on you, to sort of rethink your politics, your allegiances, your loyalties, your membership in various groups at certain times, right? I mean, this is more of a Venn diagram kind of thing for me here, Elamine, right? Where, there aren't camps on either side, right? We both want the literary community to thrive, and we want like an end to suffering elsewhere in the world, right? So this kind of like either or, and to see the places where we overlap and to stay in those places where we disagree, right? And we are locked into a relationship with each other, right? As writers, as part of this community, we are family. I don't mean that in a glib sort of new agey way, right? Like we've got a few decades of our life where we're producing work that responds to the world together. So we're in this together here. And so the idea of sides, I see more sort of concentric circles and overlap and things like that, rather than these sides. And we just, have to remain present in the spaces that our fellow writers care about, whether we agree or disagree. I'm here, I don't represent the Gillers. I want to be clear about that. I don't represent like anything here. But I just want to sort of add like another dimension to what we're seeing here. We're locked into this together, guys. And so, and maybe we're fighting the wrong, if there is an enemy, maybe we're fighting the wrong enemy, right? Maybe it's not, we don't have to look to each other to find the enemy here. It's not internal, I think.
I take seriously the thing that you just said, the idea that if there are various security mechanisms, and there were, I've seen there were so many police officers present at the Giller Prize last night. If there are various mechanisms stopping people who are outside from coming inside, then yes, I'm glad that you were one of very few people, I should know, who traversed that space to go from the inside to the outside, to take a moment and to hear a thing that may have been difficult for you to hear. I appreciate that, and I appreciate you being on the show today. Ian, thanks for your time, man.
Thanks for having this conversation, man. You could have totally avoided it, right? Well done.
Not our style. So I appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for doing it. Ian Williams won the Giller Prize back in 2019. He is this year's Massey lecturer. You will find those lectures in a new book called What I Mean to Say, Remaking Conversation in Our Time. If you'd rather listen, they are dropping all the installments this week of the Massey lectures. You should absolutely take a listen to those. You can find them at cbc.ca. Listen, this conversation is not done. We've had a lot of conversations about the Giller Prize and the funding of the arts. We are going to continue having those conversations. I promise you. In the meantime, my name is Elamine Abdulmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a great day.